Oh, thank you, Randy. And I'd like also to thank Project 2049 and the Council for inviting me today. I do work for a company called Defense Group Incorporated. When I left the world-famous RAND Corporation, I had never heard of Defense Group Incorporated, but at the time I thought to myself, you know, it does sound like a CIA front. It does sound like some sort of bond, you know, International Trade Limited or something like that, and I said, this is the right place for me to be. I have spent the last 12 years of my career off and on looking at the China cyber issue, and so it's actually interesting for me to focus instead on these long-term trends, to look back and use that as a mirror for the future, rather than what I usually have to do, which is focus on very narrow aspects of the intrusion set, the China origin intrusion set, and all of that going on. Of course, I'm a victim, as many are, of the intrusion set. The Chinese are throwing everything but the kitchen sink at my corporate networks. But I'd like to make, just to presage Kurt Campbell, I'd like to make 5 brief points. The first is at the strategic level. One of the things that fascinates me about the China cyber issue is the extent to which we face very difficult trade-offs in being able to deal with China at the strategic level on this. On the one hand, as you know, it's clearly one of the top state-based threats. But at the same time, it's also the world's IT workshop. I mean, every piece of electronics that you have in your bag or in your pocket were all made in China. And so many of the tools, whether it's trade or whether it's strategic, that we might have to be able to push back on the Chinese for some of these cyber issues are actually taken off the table because of, and this is frankly a larger microcosm of the US-China relationship, the difficult trade-offs that come with strategically interacting with a country with whom we have hundreds of billions of dollars of interdependent trade. And so whereas in the Cold War with the Soviets, there wasn't that linkage, that interdependency that restricted some of our options, we clearly have that in spades with China. And the trend line out to 2025 is simply going to continue as China pursues its national innovation agenda. More and more, it's going to go from being an export processing zone of IT componentry to actually an innovation zone of IT componentry, and our interdependence with them in terms of the technologies that we bring in is going to be even greater. And I'll talk about it at the end with respect to issues on supply chain and other things that really worry people. The second issue is I just wanted to point also, and this is not hard for the Chinese, obviously, with their philosophic tradition of being able to hold 2 contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time without cognitive dissonance, but the Chinese have long faced a very contradictory phenomena with respect to cyber and information security more broadly, which is to say that on the one hand, they know intimately that economic development, which is obviously the top state priority because it's the basis of social stability, requires access to the global information grid at every level. But at the same time, they know that the introduction of some of these technologies bring with them certain values which are inimical to single-party rule, the Chinese Communist Party, and the data and the content that comes in via these technologies is also contrary to the goal of single-party rule. So they've always had to strike this very narrow, in many ways, a knife-edge balance between access and control. But contrary to the prophets of the internet, who said basically that the tsunami of cyberspace was just going to wash authoritarian regimes off the planet and China would be liberated along with all these other countries, in fact, the Chinese government, despite its political dysfunction, despite the fact that it's an atavistic government bureaucracy, has proven remarkably nimble and flexible in responding to the introduction of a whole series of information technologies, and in many ways has the high ground with respect to the use of this medium as a potential subversion of the regime in Beijing. Of course, it's important to note that there's a lot of myths about Chinese internet censorship, the most important of which and the most pervasive of which is that it matters how many internet police China has or what technology they put in place to police the Great Firewall. In fact, the Chinese internet and cyberspace system is much more nuanced and sophisticated because they've delegated enforcement down to lower levels. I mean, just one example. The Internet Service Provider Law, I mean, anybody from Verizon or AOL in the room would get the shivers when they hear this, but the ISP law says that Chinese ISPs are responsible for the actions of all their subscribers. And what that means is they've delegated enforcement down to the market, and so the ISPs put the big mamas, the da mamas, in the chat rooms and kick people off who engage in political content. The third point is what's interesting to me, both in the China and Russia case, is how cyber has emerged in both countries as an overt tool of state power, something that both Moscow and Beijing appear very comfortable with. Overt in the sense that they don't work very hard to deny, and it's not very hard to actually attribute that these attacks, whether they be in Estonia or Georgia or the China-based intrusions in the United States, of course they get very arch when you accuse them of it. But the plausible deniability of computer network exploitation activities means that they do always have that certain measure of deniability that allows them to employ it as a tool of state power. And this is in contrast, of course, to the US approach, where computer network exploit and computer network attack activities are held at very, very highly classified levels, treated as compartmented capabilities, and the only people that are allowed to conduct them are people who have passed all manner of highly intrusive full scope polygraphs and everything else. Whereas the Chinese and the Russians, by contrast, seem very comfortable with the use of non-governmental, even non-state or non-Chinese or non-Russian proxies to be able to carry these out for them. And we've tried to confront this issue in the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, but there's such a stark cultural difference between the systems that I think it accounts for a lot of the difficulty we've had on the deterrence side in particular. Fourth, and is obviously the role of the Chinese military and computer